The warning lights flashed red across the control panel as Captain Hyun-woo fought to keep his ship steady. The small survey vessel shook violently as it entered the atmosphere of Kepler 442c. Something had gone wrong with the fusion core during the jump. Very wrong. "Come on, stay together," he whispered to his ship as sparks flew from the navigation console. The autopilot had failed 3 minutes ago. Now he was flying by feel alone, trying to find somewhere safe to land on a planet he knew almost nothing about. The surface rushed up to meet him faster than he wanted. Through the thick clouds, he could see what looked like a forest of strange, tall structures. They were too straight to be normal trees, but too organic to be buildings. He had no choice but to aim for a clearing between them. The ship hit the ground hard. Hyun-woo's safety harness cut into his chest as he was thrown forward. The sound of metal tearing and systems failing filled the small cabin. Then everything went quiet except for the hiss of escaping atmosphere. He sat still for a moment, checking if anything was broken. His left shoulder hurt, but it moved fine. His head felt fuzzy, but he could think clearly. Blood ran down his forehead from a small cut. Overall, he was lucky to be alive. Hyun-woo unbuckled himself and looked around the cabin. The main screen was cracked, but still working. Emergency power was keeping basic life support running, but the display showed that the fusion core was completely dead. No power meant no heat, no communications, and no hope of getting off this planet anytime soon. He activated the emergency beacon, knowing it would take months for anyone to find him. The nearest patrol ship was weeks away, and they would not even start looking until his ship was reported missing. That would not happen for another 30 days when he failed to check in at the next waypoint. The external sensors still worked, enough to tell him about the planet outside. The atmosphere was breathable, which was good news. The temperature was currently 15 degrees above freezing, but that was during the day. Night temperatures dropped to 30 below freezing. That was very bad news. Hyun-woo pulled on his environmental suit and opened the airlock. The air that rushed in was cold and thin, but he could breathe it without his helmet. He stepped outside to look at his ship. The survey vessel was completely destroyed. The hull had cracked in 3 places, and one of the engines had broken completely off. Fuel lines leaked blue liquid onto the strange purple grass. The ship would never fly again. Around him, the forest was unlike anything he had ever seen. The tree-like structures were made of what looked like clear crystal, but they had bark and leaves like normal trees. They grew in perfect straight lines, reaching up toward the sky like transparent pillars. Their leaves were silver and made soft ringing sounds when the wind moved through them. The ground was covered in purple grass that felt spongy under his feet. Strange flowers grew in patches, glowing with soft blue light. In the distance, he could hear sounds like bird song, but different. More musical, like a flute being played very quietly. He went back into the ship to gather supplies. The emergency kit contained basic medical supplies, a water purifier, some food packets, and a thermal blanket. That was all. His tools were in the cargo bay, which was now crushed under a piece of the engine. The scanner still worked, so he ran. A quick check of the local area. No dangerous radiation. No immediate threats from large animals. The water in a nearby stream was clean enough to drink after purification. The local plants showed no obvious signs of being poisonous, but that did not mean they were safe for humans to eat. As he worked, small creatures began to appear at the edge of the clearing. They looked like a cross between squirrels and birds, with furry bodies and tiny wings that let them glide between the crystal trees. They watched him with large, curious eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. When he moved toward them, they scattered, making sounds like tiny bells. The sun was getting lower in the sky. Hyunwoo had maybe 3 hours before dark. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast. The ship was too damaged to provide proper protection from the cold. He found a spot near the stream where several of the crystal trees grew close together. Using pieces of metal from his broken ship, he tried to build a simple shelter. It was hard work without proper tools. He had to bend and shape the metal with rocks, and his hands were soon cut and bleeding. As he worked, he noticed something interesting about the crystal trees. When he accidentally scratched one with a piece of sharp metal, it began to weep a thick, golden liquid. The liquid was warm to the touch and smelled sweet, like honey mixed with pine. Hyunwoo collected some of the liquid in his helmet. It was very sticky and seemed to get thicker as it cooled. He had no idea what it was, but it might be useful later. The shelter he built was not much to look at. 3 walls of bent metal leaning against a crystal tree, with his thermal blanket stretched over the top. It would keep the wind out, but it would not be warm. Dark came fast on this planet. One moment the sky was light purple, and the next it was black. The temperature dropped immediately. Hyunwoo pulled his environmental suit tighter and crawled into his shelter. The cold was worse than he had expected. Even with the suit and the thermal blanket, he could feel it seeping into his bones. His breath made clouds in the air, and frost began to form on the inside of his shelter. Outside, the forest came alive with new sounds. The glowing flowers became brighter, and new creatures began to move through the trees. He could hear them calling to each other with voices like singing glass. Some of them were large enough to make the ground shake when they walked. Lying in his makeshift shelter, shivering despite his best efforts to stay warm, Hyunwoo began to understand how serious his situation was. He had no fire, no proper tools, and no way to generate heat. The food packets would last maybe a week. After that, he would have to figure out what he could eat from this alien world. Most people would have given up hope. Most people would have accepted that they were going to die on this cold, strange planet. But Hyunwoo was not most people. He was human, and humans had survived worse than this. As he lay there in the dark, listening to the alien sounds outside his shelter, his mind began to work on the problem. The crystal trees, the golden liquid, the strange rocks he had seen that seemed to sparkle in the light. There had to be a way to use these things. There had to be a way to survive. He had 30 days before anyone would even start looking for him. That was 30 days to figure out how to stay alive on an alien world with nothing but his hands and his human brain. The challenge was enormous. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, despite the cold, Hyunwoo was already beginning to plan. Hyunwoo woke up feeling like ice had formed in his veins. The cold had been so intense during the night that he had barely slept. Every time he started to drift off, the shivering would wake him up again. His water bottle had frozen solid, and his breath had created a layer of ice on the inside of his thermal blanket. He crawled out of his shelter as the alien sun began to rise. The warmth felt good on his face, but he knew it would not last long. This planet had short days and long, brutal nights. The first thing he did was take inventory of everything he had. The emergency kit contained 6 food packets, each one meant to last a full day if eaten carefully. A water purifier that would work maybe 50 times before the filter died. Basic medical supplies including bandages, pain medicine, and antiseptic. 1 thermal blanket, already torn from his rough night. That was it. He looked through the wreckage of his ship again, hoping to find something useful. Most of the cargo bay was crushed, but he managed to pull out a few pieces of equipment. A broken scanner that still worked sometimes. Some spare parts, for systems that no longer existed. A small mirror from the bathroom. Nothing that would help him make fire or stay warm. The scanner gave him more bad news when he finally got it working. The atmosphere of this planet was different from Earth in ways that made fire almost impossible. The oxygen level was lower, and there was too much nitrogen. Even if he had matches or a lighter, flames would burn very weakly and die out quickly. Hyun-woo sat on a piece of his broken ship and tried not to panic. 6 days of food. No fire, no tools, no way to call for help that would arrive in time. The math was simple and terrible. He forced himself to think like the scientist he was trained to be. First priority was water. The stream was clean and would not run out. The purifier would last long enough if he was careful. Second priority was food. The emergency packets would keep him alive for less than a week, so he needed to find something else to eat. He spent the morning testing the local plants with the scanner. Most of them showed chemicals that would be poisonous to humans. A few seemed safe, but they contained almost no nutrients. He could eat them without dying, but they would not keep him alive for long. The small flying creatures he had seen the day before were back, watching him from the crystal trees. They seemed curious but not afraid. Maybe he could catch one, but they were fast, and he had nothing to trap them with. Larger animals lived in this forest too. He could hear them moving through the trees, but they stayed away from him. The scanner picked up heat signatures of creatures as big as bears, but they seemed to avoid the clearing where his ship had crashed. As the day went on, Hyun-woo began to understand just how impossible his situation was. He tried to make fire by rubbing sticks together, but the wood from the crystal trees would not burn at all. It just got warm and started leaking that golden liquid. He tried to make sparks by hitting rocks together. Some of the rocks in the area were different from normal stone. They had a metallic shine and felt heavier than they should. When he hit them with other rocks, tiny sparks would fly, but they died out immediately in the strange atmosphere. By afternoon, he was getting desperate. The temperature was already dropping, and he knew the night would be even colder than the last one. His shelter was not nearly good enough to protect him from another night like that. He tried to improve his shelter using more pieces from the ship, but without proper tools, it was almost impossible to shape the metal. His hands were cut and bleeding from trying to bend sharp edges. The crystal trees were too hard to cut with anything he had found. The golden liquid from the trees was interesting, but he could not figure out what to do with it. It was sticky and got thicker as it cooled, but it would not burn. When he spread it on metal, it made a thin coating that dried hard, but that did not help him stay warm. As the sun set, Hyunwoo faced the truth. He was probably going to die on this planet. Maybe not tonight, but soon. The cold, the lack of food, the inability to make fire, any one of these problems might be solvable, but all of them together seemed impossible. He crawled back into his shelter as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted. This night was even worse than the first. The wind picked up, cutting through the gaps in his metal walls like knives made of ice. His environmental suit helped, but it was not designed for this kind of extreme cold. Outside, the forest was full of sounds. The creatures with voices like singing glass were out there, along with things that made deep rumbling noises. Sometimes he heard what sounded like hunting calls, sharp and wild. He was glad they seemed to stay away from his area. Hyunwoo tried to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep in this cold might mean never waking up. He exercised inside his tiny shelter, doing push-ups and sit-ups to keep his blood moving. He ate one of his precious food packets, hoping the energy would help his body make heat. Around midnight, something changed in the forest sounds. The musical calls stopped, and he heard heavy footsteps moving around his clearing. Something big was out there, investigating the crash site. He held perfectly still and tried not to breathe too loudly. Through a gap in his shelter wall, he could see a faint glow moving between the trees. Whatever was out there had some kind of natural light, like the flowers but much brighter. It moved slowly and carefully, stopping often as if it was listening. After what felt like hours, the glow moved away, and the forest sounds returned to normal. Hyunwoo realized he had been holding his breath. Whatever that thing was, it was smart. Enough to be curious about his ship, but careful enough not to get too close. The rest of the night passed in a blur of cold and exhaustion. When morning finally came, Hyunwoo was barely conscious. His fingers and toes were numb, and he could not stop shivering. He had survived 2 nights, but he was getting weaker. As he crawled out of his shelter into the weak morning sunlight, he noticed something that made him pause. During the night, some of the golden liquid he had collected had changed. It was no longer sticky and soft. Instead, it had become hard like glass, but with a golden color. He picked up a piece and examined it. The liquid had not just dried. It had transformed into something completely different. It was hard enough to scratch metal, but light enough to float in water. And when he held it up to the morning light, something interesting happened. The hardened resin seemed to concentrate the light, making it brighter and warmer in a small spot. It was not much, but it was something. For the first time since the crash, Hyunwoo felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe there was a way to survive after all. Maybe these alien materials could be used in ways he had not thought of yet. He was human, and humans were good at making something from nothing. But first, he needed to live through another night. The third morning brought new determination. Hyunwoo had survived 2 nights, which was more than he had expected after that first terrible evening. His body was getting used to the cold, or maybe he was just getting tougher. Either way, he was still alive and still thinking. He decided to explore further into the crystal forest. Staying near the crashed ship felt safe, but safety would not keep him alive much longer. He needed to understand this place better if he was going to find a way to survive. The forest was stranger than he had first realized. The crystal trees grew in perfect patterns, like someone had planted them on purpose. Between them, the purple grass formed geometric shapes that looked almost too neat to be natural. Small streams flowed in straight lines, connecting pools of water that reflected the sky like mirrors. As he walked, Hyunwoo paid attention to everything. The way the light moved through the crystal trees, the sounds different plants made in the wind, the tracks left by animals in the soft ground. Was looking for anything that might help him stay alive. About 1 kilometer from his shelter, he found something interesting. A grove of crystal trees that were different from the others. These trees were larger, and their crystal bark had a rough texture instead of being smooth. When the wind blew through them, they made deeper sounds, like the low notes of an organ. What caught his attention was the base of one tree. The crystal bark was cracked, and golden resin was flowing out of the crack like a slow waterfall. But this resin was different. It was thicker, more amber in color, and it seemed to glow with its own light. Hyunwoo touched the flowing resin carefully. It was warm, much warmer than the regular tree sap he had found before. When he pulled his finger away, the resin stretched like thick honey before breaking. It left a golden coating on his skin that tingled slightly. He looked around the grove and noticed that many of these larger trees had cracks in their bark. Some of the cracks looked old, but others seemed fresh. Something was making these wounds, causing the trees to bleed their strange resin. Then he saw what was causing it. Small creatures, like the flying squirrels he had seen before, were deliberately scratching the trees with their claws. They would scratch a tree, wait for resin to flow out, then eat some of it before moving on to another tree. They were farming the resin. This gave Hyunwoo an idea. If the small animals could eat the resin, maybe humans could too. He collected some of the thick, glowing resin in his helmet and tasted a tiny amount. It was sweet, with a flavor like honey mixed with something he could not identify. It did not make him sick, and his scanner showed it contained proteins and sugars that his body could use. More importantly, the thick resin had different properties than the thin stuff he had found before. When he let it cool in the cold air, it became hard but flexible, like rubber. When he warmed it up again, it became soft and workable. As he experimented with the resin, Hyunwoo noticed something else about this grove. The rocks here were different, too. Mixed in with the normal gray stones were chunks of rock that looked almost metallic. They were dark with silver streaks, and they felt much heavier than regular rocks. When he picked up one of these special rocks, it was warm to the touch. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air around it. He wondered if they were radioactive, but his scanner showed no dangerous radiation. The warmth seemed to come from some kind of chemical reaction inside the rock. Curious, he tried hitting two of the metallic rocks together. The result was much better than his earlier attempts at making sparks. These rocks produced bright, hot sparks that lasted several seconds before dying out. The sparks were so bright they left spots in his vision. Hyun-woo sat down among the strange rocks and resin trees to think. He had found two things that might be useful: resin that could be shaped and hardened, and rocks that made good sparks. Neither one solved his problems by itself, but maybe together they could be part of a solution. He spent the rest of the day collecting materials. The thick resin was easy to gather once he learned how to scratch the trees properly. The metallic rocks were scattered throughout the grove, and he picked out the best ones based on size and how well they sparked. While he worked, the small flying creatures watched him with obvious interest. They seemed to understand that he was doing something similar to what they did, harvesting resin from the trees. A few of them even came close enough that he could see the golden stains around their mouths from eating the resin. One brave little creature landed on a rock near where he was working. It watched him scratch a tree and collect resin, then made a series of musical chirping sounds. When Hyun-woo tried to copy the sounds, the creature seemed pleased and chirped back. He wondered if it was trying to teach him something. As afternoon turned to evening, Hyun-woo gathered his materials and headed back to his shelter. He carried several kilograms of the thick resin and a collection of the best sparking rocks. He also brought some of the normal resin he had found earlier, thinking it might be useful too. The temperature was dropping again as he reached his crash site. Soon it would be dark, and he would face another night of brutal cold. But for the first time since landing on this planet, he had a plan. Back at his shelter, Hyun-woo began experimenting. He tried mixing the thick resin with pieces of the dried purple grass. The grass burned for a few seconds when hit by sparks, but it was not enough to start a real fire. The mixture burned a little longer, but still died out quickly. He tried adding small pieces of metal from his ship to the mixture. The metal helped conduct heat, but it also made the mixture too heavy to catch sparks easily. Everything he tried worked a little bit, but nothing worked well enough. As darkness fell and the cold began to bite, Hyun-woo realized he was missing something important. He had the materials he needed, but he did not understand how to use them properly. The solution was there, just out of reach. He crawled into his shelter as the forest came alive with its nightly sounds. The creatures with glowing eyes were moving through the trees again, their calls echoing off the crystal surfaces. Something big was walking around his clearing again, just like the night before. But tonight, Hyun-woo was not just trying to survive. Until morning, he was planning. In his mind, he went over everything he had learned about the resin and the rocks. There had to be a way to make them work together. The thick resin burned slowly when it caught fire. The rocks made hot, long-lasting sparks. The thin resin got very hard when it cooled. The purple grass caught fire easily but burned out fast. All the pieces were there. As he lay shivering in his shelter, listening to the alien sounds outside, Hyun-woo began to see how the pieces might fit together. It would take time and experimentation, but he thought he knew what to try next. Tomorrow, He would either find a way to make light and heat from these alien materials, or he would probably die trying. But at least now he had hope, and hope was something he could build on. The small flying creatures had shown him that these materials could be harvested and used. Now he just had to figure out how to use them the way a human would, with intelligence, creativity, and determination. The fourth day started with purpose. Hyunwoo had spent most of the night thinking about his materials and how they might work together. His hands were so cold he could barely move his fingers, but his mind was sharp and focused. He began by sorting everything he had collected. The thick, glowing resin went in one pile, the thin, regular resin in another. The metallic rocks were separated by size and how well they sparked. The dried purple grass was bundled together. He also gathered some of the silver leaves that had fallen from the crystal trees. First, he needed to understand each material better. Hyunwoo started with the metallic rocks, trying to figure out exactly what they were made of. His damaged scanner could not give him detailed information, but he could learn a lot just by observation and testing. The rocks were definitely not normal stone. They contained iron, which explained the metallic shine and the weight. But there was something else mixed in, something that made them spark so well when struck together. The sparks were not just bright, they were hot enough to leave tiny burn marks on his gloves. He spent hours learning to shape the rocks by hitting them with other stones. It was hard, frustrating work. His hands became raw and bloody, and most of his attempts ended with the rock breaking in the wrong place. But slowly he began to understand how the stone wanted to break, how to guide the fractures to create useful shapes. By noon, he had created his first successful tool, a sharp piece of the metallic rock that could cut through the purple grass like a knife. It was rough and ugly, but it worked. More importantly, it proved that he could shape these materials with nothing but patience and other rocks. Next, he experimented with the resin. The thick, glowing resin was fascinating. When he warmed it with his body heat, he could mold it like clay. When he let it cool in the frigid air, it became hard as glass. But if he warmed it again, it became soft once more. The thin resin was different. Once it hardened, heating it up again did not make it soft. Instead, it became brittle and would crack. But it was much harder than the thick resin when solid, hard enough to use as a cutting edge. Hyunwoo began mixing the two types of resin together in different amounts. Each mixture had different properties. Some stayed flexible even when cold. Others became incredibly hard. One mixture with just a tiny amount of thick resin mixed into mostly thin resin created something that was hard but would not shatter when struck. The real breakthrough came when he accidentally dropped some of his resin mixture onto the purple grass. The grass was dried out from the cold air, and when a spark from his rocks landed on the resin-coated grass, something wonderful happened. The mixture caught fire and kept burning. It was not a big flame, and it did not last very long. But it was real fire. The resin was acting like fuel, and the grass was helping it catch the sparks. For the first time since crashing on this planet, Hyunwoo had created actual fire. He immediately began refining the mixture. Too much resin, and it would not catch sparks easily. Too little, and it burned out too fast. The grass needed to be dried to exactly the right amount, not too wet, not so dry it crumbled to dust. As he worked, the small flying creatures gathered to watch. They seemed fascinated by what he was doing, chattering to each other in their musical voices. One of them brought him a piece of crystal tree bark that had an interesting texture. When he mixed it into his fire mixture, it made the flame burn brighter and last longer. The creatures were helping him. They understood that he was trying to solve a problem, and they were offering materials they thought might be useful. Hyun-woo felt a strange connection to these small aliens. They were working together, different species sharing knowledge. By late afternoon, he had created a mixture that would burn for almost 10 minutes when lit with sparks from his rocks. It was still not enough to keep a fire going all night, but it was progress. Real, measurable progress. The next challenge was making a container for his fire mixture. He tried using pieces of metal from his ship, but they conducted heat too well and burned his hands. The crystal tree bark worked better, but it would catch fire itself after a few minutes. Then he remembered the hard resin. If he could shape it into a bowl, it might work as a container. The problem was making it the right shape before it hardened. Hyun-woo spent hours figuring out how to work with the resin. He learned that he could shape it against rocks to create curves. He discovered that mixing in tiny pieces of the silver leaves made it stronger. Most importantly, he found that if he worked fast and used his body heat to keep it warm, he could create complex shapes. His first successful container was ugly and lopsided, but it held his fire mixture without burning through. When he lit the mixture with sparks, the container glowed with warm light and threw heat that he could feel on his face. As darkness began to fall, Hyun-woo felt something he had not felt since the crash. Genuine hope. He had created light and heat from nothing, but alien rocks and tree sap. It was primitive and crude, but it worked. The night was still brutally cold, but now he had a weapon against it. His resin container burned for 10 minutes, providing light and warmth. When it burned out, he could light another one. He had enough materials to make several more containers, and he knew where to get more resin and rocks. Inside his shelter, surrounded by the alien sounds of the forest, Hyun-woo worked by the light of his handmade lantern. He prepared more fire mixture, shaped more containers, and planned improvements for tomorrow. The small flying creatures had not gone to sleep like they usually did. Instead, they perched in the crystal trees around his shelter, watching the strange light he had created. Their eyes reflected the glow, making them look like tiny stars in the darkness. Something else was watching, too. Through the gaps in his shelter, Hyun-woo could see larger shapes moving in the forest. The big creatures that usually stayed away were coming closer, drawn by the light. But they did not seem threatening. They seemed curious, like they had never seen anything like fire before. As his lantern burned down to embers, Hyun-woo realized something important. He was not just surviving anymore, he was adapting. He was taking the materials this alien world provided and turning them into tools that could keep him alive. Tomorrow he would improve his lanterns. He would make them burn longer and brighter. He would figure out how to make the containers stronger and more efficient. Step by step, he was solving the puzzle of survival on this strange planet. The techniques he was developing were older than civilization, but they were working. Fire from sparks and resin, light from shaped containers, heat from carefully mixed materials. These were the same principles humans had used for thousands of years, now applied to alien materials on an alien world. As he lit his second lantern of the night, Hyunwoo smiled for the first time since the crash. He was still stranded, still alone, still in terrible danger. But he was no longer helpless. He was fighting back with the oldest weapons humanity had: intelligence, creativity, and the refusal to give up. 2 weeks had passed since the crash, and Hyunwoo had become a different person. His hands were permanently stained with resin and scarred from working with sharp rocks. His environmental suit was patched with hardened tree sap and pieces of crystal bark. He moved through the alien forest like he belonged there, reading the signs of weather and understanding the daily rhythms of the strange ecosystem. But most importantly, he had mastered fire. His lanterns now burned for over an hour, each casting steady light and reliable heat. He had learned to mix the resin with different materials to control how fast it burned. Adding silver leaves made it burn brighter. Mixing in certain types of dried grass made it burn longer. Small pieces of the metallic rocks made it burn hotter. The containers had evolved too. Instead of simple bowls, he now made lanterns with channels and air holes that controlled the flame. The hardened resin could be shaped into complex forms that directed light where he needed it and protected the flame from wind. On this particular morning, Hyunwoo was working on his biggest challenge yet. His lanterns were good enough to keep him warm and provide light, but they still required constant attention. Every hour he had to light a new one. What he needed was a way to make fire that would burn continuously through the night. He had tried simply making larger lanterns, but that did not work. The resin mixture burned too fast when there was too much of it in one place. He had tried connecting multiple small lanterns, but they did not stay lit long enough to light each other. The answer came from watching the small flying creatures again. He had noticed that they did not just eat the resin from the crystal trees. They also collected certain types of fungus that grew on the tree roots. The fungus was black and spongy, and when dried it would smolder for hours without producing much flame. Hyunwoo experimented with the fungus, learning how to prepare it properly. Fresh fungus would not burn at all. Fungus that was too dry would flare up and burn out quickly. But fungus that was dried to exactly the right point would catch a spark and then smolder steadily, producing heat and a small amount of light for many hours. The breakthrough came when he figured out how to combine the fungus with his resin mixture. He created a base of slow-burning fungus, then added small amounts of his resin mixture on top. The fungus would provide steady heat, and periodically the resin would catch fire and flare up brightly before settling back to a smolder. His new design was elegant in its simplicity. A large container made of hardened resin filled with prepared fungus and dotted with small amounts of resin mixture. Air holes around the bottom allowed just enough oxygen to keep the fungus smoldering. A removable lid could control how much air reached the fire. The first time he lit his new continuous lantern, Hyun-woo felt like he had conquered the planet. The fungus caught his spark and began to glow. Small flames danced across the surface as the resin mixture ignited and burned out. But underneath, the steady smolder continued, providing constant heat and a warm glow that pushed back the alien darkness. He let it burn all through the night, adding small amounts of resin mixture every few hours to create brighter flares when he needed more light. By morning, the fungus was still smoldering, and his shelter was warmer than it had been since the crash. The flying creatures were fascinated by his continuous fire. They gathered around his shelter in larger numbers than ever before, chattering excitedly and bringing him materials they thought might be useful. Some brought different types of fungus. Others brought varieties of dried grass he had not seen before. A few even brought small stones with interesting properties. Hyun-woo realized that his relationship with the local wildlife had changed. They no longer saw him as a strange intruder. Instead, they seemed to recognize him as another intelligent being who understood how to work with the materials the forest provided. They were teaching him, and he was learning from them. With reliable fire solved, he turned his attention to other problems. Food was still an issue. The emergency rations were long gone, and while the resin provided some nutrition, he needed more variety to stay healthy. The flying creatures had inadvertently shown him several edible options. By watching what they ate and then testing small amounts with his scanner, he found several plants that were safe for humans. None of them tasted very good, but they provided essential nutrients his body needed. More importantly, he discovered that some of these plants could be improved by cooking. Near his continuous lantern, he built a simple cooking area using flat pieces of crystal bark as plates and metal from his ship as tools. Cooked plant matter was easier to digest and seemed to provide more nutrition. He also learned to process the resin in new ways. When heated gently over his lantern, the thick resin would separate into different components. Some parts were more nutritious, others were better for making fire. The waste products could be used to waterproof his shelter or create new tools. Water was no longer a problem either. He had built a collection system that gathered moisture from the air using pieces of metal and crystal arranged to catch condensation. The system provided enough clean water to meet his needs, even during the drier periods. As his third week on the planet began, Hyun-woo had achieved something remarkable. He was not just surviving, he was thriving. His shelter was warm and dry. His lanterns provided light and heat whenever he needed them. He had identified multiple sources of food and water. He had even begun to understand the daily and seasonal patterns of this alien ecosystem. But the most important breakthrough was not technical. It was psychological. He no longer thought about rescue as his only hope of survival. Instead, he thought about rescue as an eventual convenience. He could live on this planet indefinitely if he needed to. This change in mindset freed him to think about bigger projects. He began planning improvements to his shelter that would make it more comfortable. He thought about ways to store food for emergencies. He even considered exploring further into the forest to see what other resources might be available. The flying creatures had begun to treat his camp as part of their territory. They built nests in the crystal trees around his shelter, and their young learned to recognize him as a friend rather than a threat. Sometimes they would bring him gifts, interesting rocks, unusual plants, or pieces of material that had fallen from the sky. Larger creatures had started visiting too. The bear-sized animals that had once stayed away now came to the edge of his clearing in the evenings, watching his lanterns with obvious interest. They never came close enough to be threatening, but they seemed to understand that something new and important was happening in their forest. One evening, as Hyun-woo sat by his continuous lantern working on a new project, he reflected on how much had changed. 3 weeks ago, he had been a stranded spaceship captain with no hope of survival. Now he was something new, a human who had learned to live as part of an alien ecosystem. He had taken materials that no other known species could use and turned them into tools for survival. More than that, he had figured out how to work with the local wildlife instead of against them. He was not conquering this planet. He was joining it. The techniques he had developed were completely unique. No textbook had ever described how to make lanterns from alien tree resin and metallic rocks. No survival manual had covered how to create continuous fire using alien fungus. He was writing the book on human adaptation as he lived it. As his lantern glowed steadily in the alien darkness, surrounded by the sounds of creatures that had accepted him as a neighbor, Hyun-woo realized something profound. He had not just solved the problem of survival. He had become the first human to successfully integrate into an alien ecosystem, and if rescue never came, he thought he might be okay with that. High above the crystal forest, a sleek ship hung motionless in the planet's upper atmosphere. Its hull was made of materials that bent light around them, making it invisible to most forms of detection. Inside, 3 beings watched the surface, with a mixture of confusion and growing amazement. Commander Velka of the Veltar Scientific Corps had been monitoring this planet for over 2 months as part of a routine survey mission. The Veltar were one of the most advanced species in this sector of the galaxy, with technology that could reshape matter at the molecular level and energy sources that tapped directly into quantum fluctuations. "Show me the thermal readings again," Velka requested, her 4 arms moving across the control interface with practiced efficiency. Her large eyes, evolved for seeing in multiple spectrums of light, focused on the display screen. Science Officer Mirdo manipulated the controls with his tentacle-like appendages. The heat signature first appeared 23 days ago. At first, we thought it was a natural phenomenon, perhaps a volcanic vent or a chemical reaction in the crystal formations. But then it began to move, added navigation specialist Canley, her voice carrying the harmonic overtones that made Veltar speech so melodious, and the pattern became too regular to be natural. On the screen, false color images showed the progression of thermal activity in the forest clearing. The first images showed only the cold signature of the crashed ship. Then small spots of heat began to appear. Over the weeks, these heat sources had become more regular, more controlled, more obviously artificial. The primitive vessel that crashed, we identified it as belonging to the species called humans, correct? Velka asked. Yes, Commander. A small scientific survey ship from what they call the solar system. Single occupant. The crash should have been fatal, or at least unsurvivable given the planet's conditions. Velka studied the thermal images more carefully. Her species had lost the ability to create fire from basic materials thousands of years ago when they developed quantum heating systems. The idea that any intelligent being could generate heat and light without advanced technology was difficult for her to understand. Perhaps the human has emergency heating equipment that survived the crash, suggested Myrdo. No, Conley replied, manipulating the sensor array to provide more detailed readings. We have been monitoring all electromagnetic emissions from the HFY crash site. There are no energy signatures consistent with technological heating devices. Whatever is creating that heat is not based on any technology we recognize. Velka was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. The Veltar were scientists first and foremost, and the implications of what they were observing troubled her deeply. Are you telling me that this human is creating fire using only the materials available on the planet's surface? That appears to be the case, Commander. Our long-range sensors show that the human has been harvesting resin from the crystal trees and collecting certain types of metallic rocks. The thermal signatures suggest combustion rather than technological heating. This was impossible according to everything the Veltar understood about technological development. Advanced species used quantum heaters, plasma generators, or molecular manipulation to create heat and light. Only the most primitive cultures still relied on combustion, and even then, they used prepared materials and refined techniques developed over generations. Begin closer observation, Velka ordered. I want to understand how this is being accomplished. The ship descended through the atmosphere, its stealth systems ensuring it remained undetected. Advanced sensors focused on the small clearing where the human had made his camp, recording everything in multiple spectrums of light and energy. What they observed over the following days challenged everything the Veltar thought they knew about: intelligence and survival. The human worked with his hands, shaping rocks by striking them with other rocks. This was a technique the Veltar had not used for over 50,000 years, not since they developed matter manipulation technology. Yet the human showed remarkable skill, creating tools and implements that served his purposes perfectly. Even more impressive was his work with the tree resin. The Veltar had studied the crystal trees extensively and knew that their resin had interesting properties. But they had always analyzed it with sophisticated equipment in laboratory conditions. The idea of working with it using only natural heat and simple tools had never occurred to them. He is mixing different types of resin to achieve specific properties, Myrdo reported, his voice full of wonder. Look at this. He adds the thick resin to make the mixture more flexible, then uses the thin resin to make it harder. He is controlling the molecular structure through temperature and ratio manipulation. Without any understanding of molecular theory, Conley added, he is working entirely through observation and experimentation. Velka watched as the human created fire using sparks from rocks and carefully prepared organic matter. To her people, this was like watching someone split atoms with a hammer and chisel. It should not be possible, yet it was clearly working. The thermal output is significant, she observed. His combustion process is actually quite efficient, more efficient than our first quantum heaters were. Commander, Mirdo said hesitantly, there is something else. The indigenous life forms are interacting with the human. This was true. The sensors showed that the small flying creatures were not just tolerating the human's presence, they were actively helping him. They brought him materials, showed him where to find resources, and had even begun building their nests near his shelter. Interspecies cooperation, Canley murmured, without any common language or technological interface. The Veltar had protocols for interacting with newly discovered species, but those protocols assumed that intelligence would be expressed through technology. They had procedures for communicating with beings who had developed quantum computing, antimatter physics, or dimensional manipulation. They had no procedures for communicating with someone who made fire from rocks and tree sap. What is his survival probability? Velka asked. Increasing daily, Mirdo replied after consulting his instruments. His heat generation is now sufficient to maintain body temperature through the cold periods. His food-gathering techniques are improving. He has established a reliable water source. At current trends, he could survive indefinitely. This was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. According to Veltar calculations, the planet should have been lethal to most known life forms. The atmospheric composition, the extreme temperature variations, and the lack of immediately edible vegetation should have made survival impossible. Yet the human was not just surviving, he was adapting and improving his situation daily. Commander, Canley said quietly, I believe we are witnessing something unprecedented. This human is demonstrating survival capabilities that exceed our theoretical models. Velka considered this carefully. Her people had explored thousands of worlds and contacted hundreds of intelligent species. They had never encountered anything like what they were observing. Continue monitoring, she decided. Document everything, and begin preparing a full report for the Scientific Council. What classification should we give this observation? Mirdo asked. Velka thought about the human working alone in the alien forest, creating light and heat from nothing but his intelligence and determination. She thought about the way he had learned to work with the local ecosystem instead of trying to dominate it. She thought about the techniques he was developing that her own people had forgotten millennia ago. Classification. Extraordinary, she said finally. Potential paradigm shift in our understanding of intelligence and adaptation. Below them, unaware that he was being watched, Hyun-woo continued his work. His latest project was a more efficient container design that would burn even longer while using less resin. To the Veltar observers, watching from their advanced ship with its quantum computers and molecular assemblers, he looked like a magician performing impossible feats. They did not yet understand that they were witnessing something that would change how the galaxy thought about humans forever. They were seeing the demonstration of capabilities that most advanced species had lost, the ability to create something from nothing, to adapt and survive in impossible conditions, to work with nature instead of overwhelming it with technology. The human was about to become famous throughout the galaxy, whether he knew it or not. 6 weeks after the crash, Hyunwoo had transformed his small clearing into something that looked almost like a village. His original shelter had been expanded and improved until it was a comfortable dwelling with multiple rooms. The walls were made of shaped resin panels that were stronger than metal but flexible enough to bend with the wind. The roof was a complex arrangement of crystal bark and hardened resin that shed the frequent rains while letting in light during the day. But the most impressive sight was his lighting system. A network of lanterns connected by channels carved into the ground provided illumination throughout his camp. Some burned continuously with the slow-burning fungus mixture. Others could be lit quickly when bright light was needed for detailed work. The system was so well designed that he could control the amount of light in different areas just by adjusting small flaps and covers. The Veltar observers had watched this development with growing amazement. What had started as crude survival techniques had evolved into sophisticated engineering using only natural materials and human ingenuity. His latest innovation is remarkable, Mirdo reported during their morning briefing. He has learned to create different colors of light by adding various minerals to his combustion mixture. On the observation screen, they could see Hyunwoo's camp glowing with warm yellow light, bright white working areas, and even some decorative blue and green flames. He had discovered that different metallic rocks produce different colored sparks, and he had learned to incorporate this into his lighting design. The efficiency improvements are equally impressive, Conley added. His latest lantern designs burn 4 times longer than his original attempts while using less fuel. He has optimized the airflow, the fuel mixture, and the container design through pure experimentation. Commander Velka studied the thermal readings that showed the camp's energy usage over time. His total energy output now exceeds what our emergency survival systems could provide, and he is generating it all from raw materials. This was a sobering thought for the Veltar. Their emergency survival gear, designed by their best engineers using quantum physics and molecular assembly, could not match what this human had built, with rocks and tree sap. But Hyunwoo's achievements went beyond just lighting and heating. He had developed a complete infrastructure for living on this alien world. His food processing area included containers for storing and preparing different types of plant matter. His water collection system had been expanded to provide a steady supply of clean water even during dry periods. He had even created tools for manufacturing new tools, establishing a complete technological base using only primitive techniques. The most remarkable development was his relationship with the local ecosystem. The small flying creatures now lived throughout his camp, their nests integrated into his lighting system in ways that benefited both species. The creatures helped maintain his equipment, cleaning debris from his lanterns and bringing him materials. When supplies ran low, larger animals had begun visiting regularly as well. The bear-like creatures that had once avoided the area now came to the edge of his camp every evening, apparently drawn by the light and warmth. Some of them had started leaving gifts, unusual rocks, rare plants, or interesting pieces of organic matter. He has achieved something we thought was impossible, Velka observed. Complete integration with an alien ecosystem within 6 weeks of first contact. Should we continue to observe, or should we make contact? Mirdo asked. This was the question Velka had been wrestling with for days. Standard protocols called for contact with any stranded intelligent being, but this situation was far from standard. The human was not just surviving. He was demonstrating capabilities that could revolutionize how the galaxy thought about technology and survival. Prepare for contact, she decided, but proceed carefully. We need to understand how he achieved this before we risk disrupting his work. The Veltar ship descended slowly toward the crystal forest, its stealth systems still engaged. They chose to land several kilometers away from Hyunwoo's camp to avoid frightening him or the local wildlife that had become part of his community. As they prepared for first contact, the three Veltar scientists felt something they had not experienced in their long careers: nervousness. They were about to meet a being who had accomplished what they had thought impossible, using techniques their people had forgotten millennia ago. Meanwhile, Hyunwoo was working on his most ambitious project yet. He had been experimenting with ways to create larger, more controlled fires for tasks that required high heat. His breakthrough had come when he learned to use the crystal trees themselves as part of his design. By carefully carving channels into the crystal bark and filling them with his resin mixture, he could create fires that burned in precise patterns. The crystal conducted and focused the heat in ways that let him achieve much higher temperatures than had been possible with simple containers. His newest creation was a furnace that could melt small pieces of metal salvaged from his ship. He had already used it to create better tools and more efficient lantern components. The furnace burned so hot that it created a bright column of light visible from space. It was this column of light that convinced Velka to accelerate their contact plans. The thermal signature was so intense that other ships might detect it and investigate. If the human was going to be discovered, it should be by scientists who could properly document and understand his achievements. On the morning of his 43rd day on the planet, Hyunwoo was adjusting the airflow on his furnace when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the unmistakable hum of advanced spacecraft engines, something he had not heard since his own ship crashed. He looked up to see a sleek vessel descending through the crystal trees, moving with the careful precision of a ship under intelligent control. His first thought was rescue. But as the ship came closer, he realized it was not human in design. The hull was too smooth, the proportions too elegant, the technology too advanced. The ship landed gently in a clearing about 50 meters from his camp. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a section of the hull dissolved, revealing an opening, and three figures emerged. Hyunwoo had never seen aliens before, but he knew immediately that these beings were far more advanced than humans. They moved with careful precision, and their equipment glowed with energy that spoke of technologies beyond human understanding. The lead figure approached slowly, making gestures that seemed intended to show peaceful intentions. When it spoke, a device translated its words into accented but understandable human speech. "Greetings, human. I am Commander Velka of the Veltar Scientific Corps. We have been observing your remarkable achievements on this world." Hyunwoo looked around his camp, at the network of lanterns, the sophisticated furnace, the integrated ecosystem he had built with the local wildlife, and tried to see it through alien eyes. He realized that what had started as simple survival had become something much more significant. "How long have you been watching?" he asked. "Since your third day," Velka replied honestly. "We wanted to understand how you accomplished what you have accomplished." "And do you understand it?" Velka paused, consulting with her companions in their musical language before answering. "We understand what you did. We do not understand how you knew to do it. Your techniques are more advanced than anything we have seen from a species at your technological level." Hyun-woo smiled, feeling a strange pride in his primitive accomplishments. "They are not advanced techniques. They are very old techniques applied to new materials. That," said Velka, "is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all." As the morning sun shone through the crystal trees, illuminating the camp that glowed with handmade light and hummed with carefully controlled fires, the first meeting between humans and Veltar began. Neither species yet realized that this encounter would change the galaxy's understanding of intelligence, adaptation, and the value of primitive wisdom in an advanced universe. 2 years later, the story of Captain Hyun-woo and his impossible survival had spread throughout the known galaxy. What had started as a simple rescue report had become the most widely studied case in xenological history. Universities across dozens of worlds taught courses on primitive innovation theory based on his techniques. The Galactic Scientific Council had created an entirely new field of study called baseline adaptation sciences. But Hyun-woo himself had become something even more significant than a famous survival story. He had become the galaxy's first example of what humans could accomplish when stripped of their technology and forced to rely on nothing but intelligence and determination. The Veltar had offered to take him home immediately after first contact, but Hyun-woo had asked for time to document his techniques properly. That time had stretched into months as scientists from across the galaxy came to study his work. His small camp had grown into a research station, but one unlike any other in the galaxy. Instead of sterile laboratories filled with quantum computers and molecular assemblers, the research station operated primarily on Hyun-woo's handmade technology. Visiting scientists had to learn to work with resin lanterns, crystal furnaces, and tools shaped from alien rocks. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever created anything with their own hands. The applications extend far beyond survival techniques, Dr. Sithra of the Centauri Institute explained to her colleagues during a galactic conference broadcast across 17 star systems. What Captain Hyun-woo demonstrated is that intelligence itself can be a form of technology. When advanced beings become dependent on quantum systems and molecular manipulation, we lose the ability to adapt to truly alien conditions. The conference was being held aboard a massive space station in neutral territory with representatives from dozens of species. But all attention was focused on the human section of the presentation, where Hyun-woo himself was demonstrating his techniques via holographic projection from his research camp. The resin mixture requires precise timing, he explained, his hands working with materials that looked primitive but performed functions that amazed the assembled scientists. Too much heat and it burns too fast. Too little and it will not catch the sparks properly. But when you get it right, It burned steadily for hours with just these basic materials. In the audience, beings with technology that could reshape reality watched with fascination as a human made fire from tree sap and rocks. Some of them took notes with devices that stored information in quantum matrices. Others recorded everything with sensors that could detect individual molecular movements. All of them were learning. The psychological impact has been as significant as the technical discoveries, noted Ambassador Krell-Voth of the Hegemony Council. Before the Hyunwoo incident, most species viewed humans as a moderately clever but technologically primitive race. Now, every major power in the galaxy is trying to understand what other capabilities humans might possess. This was true. The story of one man's survival had changed how the entire galaxy viewed humanity. Trade negotiations that had once dismissed humans as junior partners now treated them as equals. Scientific collaborations that had once excluded human researchers now actively sought their participation. Military alliances that had once seen humans as useful but limited allies now wondered what other impossible achievements humans might be capable of. The Veltar had been particularly affected by their observations of Hyunwoo's work. Their entire society had been built on the assumption that technological advancement meant abandoning primitive techniques in favor of more sophisticated methods. Watching Hyunwoo achieve results they could not match with methods they had forgotten, had forced them to reconsider their entire technological philosophy. We have begun teaching baseline adaptation courses to all our scientists, Commander Velka reported to the conference. Our people need to relearn skills that we abandoned 50,000 years ago. Skills that, as Captain Hyunwoo demonstrated, remain valuable even for the most advanced civilizations. The Veltar were not alone in this response. Across the galaxy, advanced species were rediscovering the value of primitive techniques. Universities that had not taught basic chemistry for millennia were creating new courses in fundamental material science. Military academies that had focused entirely on quantum warfare were adding survival training to their curricula. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed the concept of intelligence itself. Before Hyunwoo, most species had assumed that true intelligence was measured by the sophistication of the technology a being could create or use. Now intelligence was being redefined as the ability to adapt and solve problems, regardless of available resources. What Captain Hyunwoo proved, explained Dr. Maria Santos, the human xenological attaché to the Galactic Council, is that intelligence is not about having the most advanced tools. It is about being able to work with whatever tools you have, or being able to make tools from whatever is available. This new understanding had practical implications that reached every corner of galactic civilization. Exploration missions to primitive worlds now included specialists trained in baseline adaptation techniques, research projects studying alien environments now considered what could be learned from working with local materials using simple methods. Even advanced manufacturing processes were being improved by incorporating principles that Hyunwoo had discovered while trying to survive on an alien world. The research station that had grown around Hyunwoo's original camp had become one of the most important scientific facilities in the galaxy. Scientists came there not just to study his techniques, but to learn a completely different way of thinking about problems. They learned to observe carefully, experiment patiently, and build solutions from whatever materials were available. "We call it the Hyun-woo method," explained Dr. Kesfin, a crystalline being whose species had been working with quantum physics for over 1,000,000 years. Instead of imposing our technological solutions on alien environments, we learn to work with what the environment provides. It has revolutionized our understanding of adaptive intelligence. The method had already proven its value in dozens of practical applications. Colonies on harsh worlds that had struggled with expensive technological solutions were now thriving using adapted versions of Hyun-woo's techniques. Research expeditions to dangerous environments were achieving better results with simpler, more adaptable equipment. Even military units were finding that soldiers trained in baseline adaptation were more effective in unpredictable situations. But for Hyun-woo himself, the most satisfying aspect of his galactic fame was not the recognition or the scientific breakthroughs. It was the knowledge that he had changed how beings throughout the galaxy thought about the relationship between intelligence and technology. "When I was trying to survive on that planet," he told the conference, "I was not trying to prove anything about human capabilities. I was just trying to stay alive until tomorrow. But I learned something important during those first few weeks. The most advanced technology in the universe is still a thinking mind that refuses to give up." As he spoke, his words were being translated into hundreds of languages and broadcast to billions of beings across the galaxy. In classrooms on advanced worlds, students were learning about the human who had made fire from alien tree sap. In research laboratories, scientists were applying his principles to solve problems that quantum computers could not handle. In the halls of government, leaders were reconsidering what it meant to be an advanced civilization. The small lantern that Hyun-woo had created from resin and rocks had become a symbol that appeared on everything from scientific papers to military insignias. It represented more than just survival. It represented the idea that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible it seemed. Years later, when humanity finally took its place as a major power in galactic civilization, historians would point to many factors that contributed to that rise. They would mention humanity's diplomatic skills, their military innovation, their economic adaptability, and their scientific creativity. But most would agree that it all started with one man, alone on an alien world, who refused to accept that survival was impossible. He had no tools, no fire, and no hope of rescue. But he had something more valuable than any advanced technology, a human mind that could turn tree resin and rocks into light and warmth and hope. In a galaxy full of quantum, computers and molecular assemblers that had proven to be the most advanced technology of all,